Subcommittee will come to order. Let me start by recognizing myself and ranking member to present our opening statements. And without objection, the members of the subcommittee can present brief remarks if they choose to, or they can submit them for the record. We convened this hearing today to discuss the merits of the U.S.-China Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, which was submitted to Congress in late April. This 30-year agreement, which is required by Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 and is a prerequisite for any significant nuclear cooperation with any country, any other country other than the United States. The movement of nuclear material and technology across borders deserve close examination. Today, we expect to hear from our distinguished witnesses on their assessment of the viability of our civil nuclear cooperation with China, as well as what their concerns may be about nuclear proliferation and the transfer of technology and knowledge for military purposes. We also expect to hear about the potential benefits of the 123 agreement, including expanded engagement with China, building mutual confidence, increasing clean energy sources, and supporting U.S. businesses. China's nuclear power program is the most rapidly expanding in the world. So the U.S.-China 123 agreement could provide a unique opportunity for U.S. businesses. The Department of Energy approved a bid by Westinghouse to build 4 nuclear reactors in China, and 6 more are planned. But as many as 30 more are proposed. Currently, China has an additional 23 reactors under construction and plans to build up to 100 more by 2030. PRC announced in December 2014 that it would spend about $11.2 billion annually on reactor construction during the next 10 years. However, I'm concerned about U.S. transferring its technology to China because Chinese firms may eventually re-export reactor technology to other countries without proper U.S. checks. Approximately 30% of the work outlined under current contracts is being performed by the United States, in the United States by Westinghouse or its subcontractors and suppliers, which has created or is sustaining approximately 8,000 direct jobs and another approximately 20,000 indirect jobs in the United States, in 20 United States. But technology transfer provisions in the contract would reduce U.S. participation in Chinese nuclear projects over time. I'd be interested to hear from our witnesses how we would secure jobs for American workers with these limitations in the provisions in the agreement. The agreement also raises important security questions. The Defense Intelligence Agency warned in February 2015 that China will continue to be a source of dual-use WMD applicable goods, equipment, and materials to countries of concern like Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Furthermore, the Nonproliferation Assessment Statement submitted with the administration's proposed agreement states that despite updates to regulations and improved actions in some areas, proliferation involving Chinese entities remains a significant concern. Without proper U.S. oversight of continued civil nuclear cooperation, I'd be hesitant to condone an agreement that would pose major risks to our national security, and I'd like to hear from our administration witnesses as to how we can address those concerns. The second concern involves military diversion. Experts have debated whether China has already diverted or intends to divert U.S. civilian nuclear technology for military purposes, including in naval reactors, which would violate the existing 123 agreement. Chairman Royce voiced this concern far back as 2007, and at a Senate Foreign Relations hearing in May of this year, it seemed to confirm that suspicion. I'd like to hear what the administration intends to do to remedy potential violations and hear how the United States will safeguard our sensitive technology from Chinese military diversion in the future. Lastly, I am concerned with China's plans to re-export nuclear power plants based on U.S. technology. Westinghouse's AP1000 technology is a crucial component to China's planned nuclear export program, though China only holds a license to use that technology domestically. What safety considerations exist during the re-export of U.S. reactor technology? Aggressive Chinese exports of nuclear technology, particularly to countries that do not currently have nuclear power, could pose proliferation risks. In fact, the Non-Proliferation Assessment Statement noted that China's ongoing construction of new nuclear power plants in Pakistan as inconsistent with its nuclear suppliers group commitments. Nearly 30 years ago, President Reagan said he was particularly proud of the agreement, saying it will open broad opportunities for joint work in development of the energy base which China needs for her modernization. At the time, the United States and China made mutual pledges of cooperation, nonproliferation, and safety. We're here today to discuss whether China has met those obligations. When President Obama submitted the new 123 agreement, he said that the agreement will advance the nonproliferation and national security interests of the United States. I'd like to hear from the administration why Congress should feel confident that China will live up to nonproliferation commitments, that we will have measures in place to prevent military diversion of our technology, and how we could safeguard our economic, political, and military interests. Members present are going to be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record, and without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of the limitation rules. I now recognize Ranking Member, actually I'm going to recognize Mr. Keating, who is the Ranking Member here today, for any remarks he'd like to make, and then I'll recognize the other chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, and Chairman Poe. Ranking Member Sherman will be here during the course of the hearing. In continuing the United States' long-standing commitment to preventing nuclear proliferation around the world, it's critical we provide the U.S.-China Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement with proper scrutiny. Our relationship with China is multifaceted and complex. There's no denying that the U.S. has a much different posture toward China than we did when the last 123 agreement was entered into in 1985. In many ways, the Chinese government has improved its nonproliferation efforts since joining the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and Nuclear Suppliers Group in 1992 and 2004, respectively. However, there remains little doubt that the Chinese government still has work to do when it comes to enforcing its own export control laws, preventing the sale of dual-use goods, and prosecuting individuals and companies involved in proliferation to countries like North Korea and Iran. China's unfortunate track record of stealing trade secrets by means of cyber attacks and other methods is a further reason to be cautious about unduly trusting China when it comes to technological transfers. While I'm encouraged that the new China 123 agreement includes stronger enforcement of nonproliferation controls, I remain concerned about whether China will meet its nonproliferation obligations. In particular, I'm interested to determine whether, under this new agreement, whether China will be able to re-export nuclear reactors based on U.S. design technology without having to obtain permission from the U.S. government. China's obligations under this agreement in the case of retransfers to third countries need to be clearly defined and understood. In addition, I question whether China could divert elements of U.S. reactor designs for use in their nuclear submarine reactors, a prospect that could challenge U.S. naval superiority. These are among the concerns that I look forward to hearing addressed at today's hearings with our witnesses, and I hope that the hearing will contribute to a productive and detailed dialogue regarding our current nuclear energy cooperation with China and the security risks we have at hand. With that, I yield back.
Now recognize Chairman Poe.
Thank you, Chairman Salmon, for working with our subcommittee to put together this important hearing about the U.S.-China 123 agreement. The current agreement was negotiated, as you said, by the Reagan administration 30 years ago. It has allowed us to cooperate with China on civilian nuclear energy, and it's supposed to expire in December. China is the world's largest market for nuclear technology. By 2032, China will become the world's largest generator of nuclear power. There are major U.S. economic interests at stake. Chinese contracts to American companies have created billions of dollars in U.S. exports and thousands of American jobs, and we've partnered with China in valuable joint ventures and development projects. For example, in July of 2007, contract awarded to Westinghouse will supply China with 4 AP-1000 nuclear power plants at an estimated cost of $8 billion. Proponents of the new agreement make the point that if this agreement is not renewed, the Chinese or the United States nuclear industry will face billions of dollars of lost revenue. They're also concerned that without these new Chinese contracts, the U.S. industry will struggle to keep up with its expertise. Our engagement with China under the current 123 agreement has advanced China's nuclear nonproliferation policies and practices. American equipment and technology exports have allowed China to use the safest technology in the industry. And the new agreement requires China to notify us before approving technology transfers and limits these transfers to countries committed to use them for peaceful purposes only. Our nuclear engagement with China has been crucial in reducing China's carbon emissions as well. Proponents of renewing the 123 agreement argue that ending our cooperation will disrupt China's nuclear development plans and have a negative environmental effect. Despite that, there are several concerns regarding the renewal of our nuclear cooperation with China. China has yet to show it has political will to prevent Chinese-based companies from exporting nuclear technology and equipment to countries such as Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Even this week, we've heard of a Carl Lee, the so-called AQ Khan, helped Iran get nuclear technology from China, namely high missile technology that is illegal. The Chinese government response to this action was they never heard of him or go fishing. The Congressional Research Service last unclassified review of China's proliferation record in January spotlighted China's proliferation activities related to Pakistan, North Korea, and Iran. The current 123 agreement does not require China to place civilian nuclear facilities under IAEA safeguards. Another point missing from the current agreement is nuclear consent right provisions. That means that China is not required to seek U.S. consent to manufacture or re-export U.S.-designed reactors or U.S. nuclear components. And we also don't know what extent China is diverting technology from its civilian nuclear energy program to its nuclear weapons and military programs. Experts have noted that Chinese civil and military nuclear entities are alarmingly close and may already be cooperating. The President's Nonproliferation Assessment Statement explicitly points out China's longstanding tradition of using civil technology for its military programs. So this hearing today will help us better understand the advantages for renewing this 123 agreement, what's in the best national security interest of the United States. And I thank the chairman, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think when we look at the proposed pending agreement, it's a balancing act for the United States. I think our national security and global nonproliferation goals need to be preeminent, but we can't be ignorant of the business implications and the competition for the Chinese market that is hot. Congressional objections to a 123 agreement with China are not new. The current agreement, as has been noted, began during the Reagan administration, submitted in 1985 to Congress. Congress then saw fit to place conditions on the implementation of the agreement in the joint resolution relating to the approval and implementation of the proposed agreement for non-nuclear cooperation between the U.S. and the PRC and the Foreign Relations Authorization Act for fiscal years 1990 and 1991. The presidential certifications contained in these pieces of legislation represented the far-reaching concerns Congress had then and in many cases still continues to have about China. Before the agreement was implemented a full 13 years after being submitted to Congress, the President had to make certifications with respect to China's assurance that it was not transferring nuclear weapons technology to non-nuclear states. Chinese non-proliferation policies and political reforms were being made by the PRC government. The non-proliferation landscape in China has changed since then. China acceded to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 1992 as a nuclear weapons state and since has become a member of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. China implemented a safeguards agreement with the IAEA in 1989 and agreed to the additional protocol in 2002. It should be noted that integrated China into the international non-proliferation regime does add a level of transparency previously lacking. Considering the growth of the nuclear technology industry in China, this integration and its accompanying benefits could be seen as welcome developments. Today, China has 26 operational nuclear reactors with 23 under construction and a plan to build another 100 by the year 2030. As a matter of comparison, the United States has 99. China and Chinese entities, however, have a nuclear track record that cannot be wiped under the carpet. The U.S. government has certified that China provided assistance to the nuclear weapons program in Pakistan. China transferred gaseous uranium hexafluoride to Iran for centrifuge enrichment research. And the U.S. continues to sanction state-owned enterprises and small and medium enterprises in China that have been sources of illicit dual-use technology for foreign buyers. There is a demonstrated wanton disregard for export restrictions in China, and the PRC seemingly refuses to take enforcement action against those violators. At the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing in May, Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation stated that China has neither the bureaucratic capability nor the political will adequately to control dual-use exports. That's especially concerning, provided that North Korea and Iran have documented operations to procure sensitive nuclear technologies in China. During our review period, we're going to have to consider these among lots of other issues. And Congress takes seriously its commitment to non-proliferation, as we know the administration does as well. So I look forward, Mr. Chairman, to hearing the testimony today and hearing how we address some of these thorny issues that, as I said, cannot be ignored during this review period. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With over 20 nuclear reactors currently in operation and 28 more under construction, China is one of the largest and fastest growing nuclear energy markets in the world. Private companies in other countries, such as the Russian Federation and France, can openly compete for construction operations contracts for Chinese reactors and share best practices to avoid delays, reduce cost, and expedite construction. In South Carolina, SCANA and Santee Cooper each are successfully operating a Westinghouse AP1000 nuclear reactor built by Chicago Bridge and Iron, identical to the reactors currently being built in China now. I regularly hear from their employees about the benefits of sharing lessons learned and best practices. We should reauthorize the agreement to ensure that American companies have the same opportunity to compete for Chinese nuclear contracts and to share resources. I am grateful to sponsor House Joint Resolution 56, which provides for the approval of the new U.S.-China Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. I would like to thank Chairman Matt Salmon and Chairman Ted Poe for putting together this hearing with very credible panelists, and look forward to the continuation of the U.S.-China civilian nuclear cooperation, which is personal to me as my father served in China in 1944 and 1945, where he developed an appreciation of the people of China as a member of the U.S. Army Air Corps defending the people of China.
Thank you. Do any other members seek recognition? We have two panels today, and believe we're going to get a wealth of knowledge regarding this issue, and appreciate the expertise of the folks that are here today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Assistant Secretary Thomas Countryman, who heads the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation at the Department of State, and Lieutenant General Frank Klotz, Undersecretary for Nuclear Security and Administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration and Department of Energy. Mr. Countryman.
I'd like to thank the two chairmen, Mr. Salmon and Judge Poe, and the ranking members and all the members for this opportunity. The agreement you have before you replaces the agreement originally negotiated in the Reagan administration in 1985, and it is an improvement over that agreement in all respects. This agreement is not a commercial contract. It does not provide for the sale of nuclear equipment or technology to China. Rather, it provides a framework under which the United States can make the decisions on particular requests for export of nuclear technology to China. It is not a giveaway. It rather is a mutual recognition that the U.S. and China have reciprocal obligations to each other that each must meet. And it recognizes also that the world is different from 1985 and that China is now among the world leaders in nuclear technology. It is not a lever. It is not something that's simply given away to China with which we can extract concessions from China in unrelated fields. This agreement meets all the requirements of the Atomic Energy Act. It also reflects the consistent position of this administration that in negotiation of 1, 2, 3 agreements, our highest priority are non-proliferation standards. The agreement has important benefits, as noted already, in the field of economic interests of the United States, including jobs. It also, of course, is an essential element in helping to manage the complex bilateral relationship that we have with the People's Republic of China. But my responsibility in leading negotiations and the responsibility that both Congress and the administration have given is to ensure that nonproliferation concerns are uppermost. And I believe we have fully met that standard. This is not to say that we are satisfied with the performance of China on a number of issues, particularly on export control issues. As was noted, I testified to the Senate 2 months ago that China has not shown the necessary capability and will to fully enforce export control requirements, its own legislation and its obligations under UN Security Council resolutions. And I welcome higher-level political attention being given to those issues. It is necessary that the Chinese government hear that this is an issue of significant political and security concern. At the same time, it is important to recognize, as Congressman Connolly has, that the performance of China in non-proliferation standards is far different from what it was 30 years ago. It continues to improve. We are in no way satisfied with the degree of improvement, and we will continue to press for China to meet its obligations more fully. But it would be incorrect to think that Chinese performance would improve if this agreement is not implemented. I am convinced exactly the opposite would happen. On the military issues and technology transfer issues that have been raised, I refer back to a closed briefing that we provided last month, to the briefing provided at that point by the experts in nuclear propulsion technology, and the reasons that we gave at that point for the President's conclusion that this agreement does not pose an unacceptable risk to America's national security. We are, of course, happy in closed session to repeat all of those briefings individually or for the committee as a whole. With those comments that I hope are responsive to the initial concerns you've raised, I recommend to you this agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, General.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Salmon, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity to testify on behalf.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask the General to thank you, move it close to your mouth. Thank you.
I'm pleased to join my colleague from the State Department, Assistant Secretary Tom Countryman. I'm pleased to also represent the Department of Energy in discussing this proposed U.S.-China agreement for peaceful nuclear cooperation. I've provided a written statement for the record, and I respectfully request that it be submitted for the record. Secretary of Energy Moniz and I share the view that the proposed agreement provides a comprehensive framework for nuclear cooperation with China while fully protecting and advancing U.S. interests and policy objectives with respect to nuclear nonproliferation and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Thus, the Department of Energy fully supports entry into force of this agreement following the requisite congressional review period. The agreement is fully consistent with law and incorporates all the terms required by Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act. Moreover, it reflects important advances over the current agreement, several of which were discussed during the classified briefing to members of this committee that Assistant Secretary Countryman just alluded to. Specifically, the successor agreement enhances the provisions that allow China to enrich and reprocess U.S. obligated nuclear material by requiring that such enrichment and reprocessing take place only at facilities in China that fall under the International Atomic Energy Agency Safeguards Agreement. It also provides for enhanced controls on the export of nuclear technology to China, and it commits both sides to deliver export control training to all U.S. and Chinese entities under the 123 agreement. Taken together, these elements, not included in the 1985 agreement, provide an unprecedented level of insight into commercial transactions. Since the preceding 123 agreement was signed 30 years ago, we have witnessed China make significant strides in its civil nuclear program. The Department of Commerce, in fact, has identified China as one of the largest and most important markets for the U.S. nuclear industry, with over 20 nuclear power plants in operation, over 20 under construction, and dozens more planned. And China will continue to invest heavily in its nuclear industry to meet its own expanding energy needs and to meet growing global interests in and demand for nuclear power as a source of clean energy. The rapid growth of China's civil nuclear energy program could have significant benefits for U.S. industry, as well as our scientific and technical base. American civil nuclear companies already have numerous joint ventures with China, as well as significant assets on the ground in China. They are supplying China with equipment and components, as well as a broad range of services, including engineering, construction, and training. The successor 123 agreement will facilitate continued nuclear cooperation with China, subject, as always, to U.S. government review of specific requests to transfer nuclear technology, information, material, equipment, and components. On the other hand, if the agreement lapses or is not renewed, U.S. industry will not be able to continue with the current ventures and could lose significant investments it's already made in China's civil nuclear program. U.S. industry would also be precluded from taking advantage of opportunities in the world's fastest-growing civil nuclear energy market. In addition to these economic benefits, the successor 123 agreement will also serve as an umbrella for other forms of U.S.-China bilateral cooperation in promoting important U.S. policy objectives with respect to enhancing nuclear safety and security around the world, an objective which directly supports our U.S. national interest as well as those of our allies and partners. U.S.-China cooperation in the civil nuclear realm, such as under the 1998 U.S.-China Peaceful Uses of Nuclear Technology, or PUNT agreement, has been absolutely invaluable in this regard. Just recently, senior U.S. officials met with their Chinese counterparts in Chengdu under the auspices of the PUNT Joint Coordinating Committee. They discussed nuclear technology, security and safeguards, environmental and waste management, emergency response operations, the security of radiological sources, and so on. U.S. participants have reported to me that they had unique and unprecedented access to a number of construction, scientific, and academic sites. This level of interaction and access is only possible because of the value that China places in having a 123 agreement with the United States and its desire to cooperate with us. Without entry into force of the successor agreement, we will lose a critical mechanism for influencing China's nonproliferation behavior, we will lose economic and commercial benefits, and we will lose the insight we have into China's nuclear programs. Again, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, Chairman, and I look forward to any questions that you all may have.
Thank you. General Klotz, I'd like to begin my question with you. Regarding the new technology transfer mechanism in the agreed minute, how would the new process affect the existing technology transfer authorization process under the 810 authorization? Would the agreed minute supplement or replace the 810 authorization?
Mr. Chairman, in fact, the 810 authorization process is already a very rigorous review process in which, as the Secretary of Energy considers each of the applications for the transfer of technology, we go and work very, very closely with the other departments, Department of State, Department of Commerce, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Department of Defense, and we also consult very closely with the intelligence community. Recall that the Department of Energy is part of one of the 17 organizations that's part of the intelligence community, and we draw upon the intelligence expertise resident within our national labs. So that process will continue to be followed for all applications under the 810 process.
My understanding is that under the new agreement that these transfers are authorized by the agreement itself. Previously, DOA shared these requests as well as any decisions you made on them with Congress. Is that, my understanding is that process is being streamlined and altered pretty dramatically. Is that not a correct understanding?
Well, to address the issue of streamlining, we have gone through a number of steps in the past several months in response to direction from Congress, in response to a report rendered by the GAO to make the process for 810 applications more efficient and more transparent. One of the issues that has been a problem in slowing down that process has been the need for approval of each application, the requirement for the Department of State to go to whatever country that we are considering a 123 agreement with to get a non-proliferation assurances. What this particular agreement does is to wrap those non-proliferation assurances into the 123 agreement. In effect, it escalates it from the 810 process into the 123 process, so the non-proliferation assurances are moved to that level of a state-to-state agreement. So with that, we will still go through the very rigorous, robust vetting of each and every 810 application through the interagency process, which, as I said, includes all of the national security agencies as well as the Department of Commerce and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
I just have a concern that given their likely violation of their pledge not to divert U.S. civilian technology for military purposes under the existing 123, maybe we should be tightening the tech transfer authorizations rather than streamlining them as in the agreed minute. That's my concerns. And I'm going to yield to Mr. Keating for any questions he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank both of gentlemen for their service to their country. And I was interested in Mr. Countryman's opening remarks when he brought up the fact that he thought it would be great to engage in more political intervention. I realize the nature of the agreement and the importance of the agreement and the time significance with the old agreement, how the world has changed, and the need for this. However, I'm curious, since you brought it up, what kind of political engagement are you considering, or what would you recommend, given your background, your prior background as well?
Well, I hesitate to make recommendations to members of the Congress. My point is that we have literally hundreds of issues on the bilateral agenda with China. It is the most complex bilateral relationship in the world today. We have complex structure of dialogues with China, government to government, and those hundreds of issues are covered. It is more than possible that the Chinese government loses sight of what I consider to be a crucial issue, ineffective enforcement of their own trade control laws. They lose sight of that when it is packaged together with the other 99 issues that are essential to the bilateral relationship. And although the State Department has raised this issue with high levels of the Chinese government, I think that repetition from a variety of sources will help the Chinese government to find the will and the resources to more effectively enforce its own laws.
Yeah. I do suspect that most of the concern this morning will be based on not the agreement itself per se, but the lack of enforcement. Their dealings with Pakistan and their violating of their own laws. And I just want to ask both of you, what do you think can be done about their own, to improve their own enforcement? And if you could speculate, I know it's hard to speculate on the Chinese, how much of it is, if any, is their inability to enforce it versus their just compliance in letting that occur? I know that's broad, but I think it's going to be central to what we're probing this morning.
First, in terms of enforcement, you should have no doubt, as we have briefed repeatedly and are always ready to brief again, that we have a rigorous examination process before exports of technology are approved, and that they include all relevant expertise of the United States government, not just these two guys here. Our enforcement will be strong, and we have the mechanisms within the 123 to suspend or cease cooperation if there are violations on the Chinese side. In terms of Chinese enforcement of trade controls, first, Li Fangwei, or Carl Li, who's been mentioned, is not a new name to us. We've worked on this issue for years. We've had some success for the Chinese in limiting his activities, and yet he remains active. I would point out he remains active primarily in the ballistic missile technology realm rather than in the nuclear realm, and has provided important technology to Iran in that respect. It is kind of a chicken and egg question to say whether the Chinese need to find the will or the resources. They have a Wild West economy with a number of private entrepreneurs who are capable of utilizing both high technology companies and, I assume, good connections within the Chinese bureaucracy to pursue trade that ought to be controlled. We strongly believe that the Chinese government can do more, needs to make a political decision to do more. We will continue to press them to do that, and the 123 agreement is exactly what provides us the access to continue to press that issue.
General, could you comment, if you could, too, given the shortness of time, also reference the CAP 1400 issue in terms of our ability or what we might be able to do to limit which country China goes to export this?
Well, let me, if I could, sir, follow up on your original question. Another element of the 123 agreement, which I think is extraordinarily important, is the provision that for tech transfers that we engage in joint training of U.S. entities and Chinese entities on what the requirements of the tech transfer is. This is very, very important as a means of educating Chinese counterparts of what the specific rules are. We also go through that process in our other engagements across the range of issues associated with safety, security, research and development on new approaches to reactor design as well as fuel fabrication. On the specific issue of the AP 1000 and the CAP 1400, any tech transfer which is approved by the Secretary of Energy is subject to the provisions within the 123 agreement on diversion of technology to military purposes and the export or re-export of that technology to other countries. So if that were an issue, that is something that we would address directly and squarely.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Poe.
Thank you both for being here, and thank you, Mr. Countryman, for being available to answer questions before this hearing to all of us on the panel here. I'd like to look at this from a little higher level. This is an agreement between the United States and China to let us do business with China in the nuclear industry. Is that a fair statement? Civilian nuclear capability.
Yeah, essentially correct. As General Klotz pointed out, it also provides for other areas of cooperation directly between Department of Energy and counterparts in China.
But anyway, it's an agreement to do business in civilian nuclear capability. So we decide we're not going to do that. We're just not going to do business with the Chinese. The void, and just correct me if I'm wrong, what would occur is then that our nuclear technology, which I think is the best in the world, bar none, rather than they being in China helping them develop their nuclear capability. And I mean, in China, they would be there physically to monitor the construction of these plants. Is that a fair statement? Which is jobs and income to American companies. That's not going to happen, but would the void then would be filled by some other country. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. There are other countries that are eager to sell nuclear power plants to China.
Like France, Russia maybe.
France, Russia, Japan, South
Japan,
Korea.
there's a whole bunch. But we're the best in the world, so the Chinese preferably would do business with us because we do it better than anybody else. Is that a fair statement or not? General, you want to make that comment?
No, I would agree with that statement.
Okay. So not agreeing to do business with them causes a void that's going to be filled by somebody else. And all of the issues that were discussed with the problems, possible problems with the Chinese cheating, I know we'd be shocked if they did, are still going to occur. All of those issues are still going to occur with their proliferation with other countries if they choose to do so. Is that right or wrong?
Yes, sir, and our ability to engage with the Chinese on all of those issues will be diminished.
Because we don't have agreement to do business with them. Also under this agreement, does the U.S. government and our different departments manage and control and authorize what we actually sell to China?
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you a question, General. I know you're Air Force guy, as I was, but I saluted folks like you, being just a sergeant. This canned coolant pump, I understand that the submarines, that's the new wave of naval activity throughout the world, and the coolant pump helps them get real quiet. We've heard some concerns about the canned coolant pumps and that technology being transferred to China. Can you fill me in on that?
Sir, we discussed that at some length in the closed briefing that we had for members of the committee. As Assistant Secretary Countryman said, we had representatives from naval reactors and the intelligence community there. I would love to follow up with you on that discussion. Obviously, technology associated with our submarine program and naval propulsion is extraordinarily sensitive, so I'd be very, very happy to pursue that with you.
All right, we'll follow up on some other basis. So, based on everything you know, both of you, this is my last question. Based upon everything you know, the criticism, the concerns, the Chinese, the deal with the dealing with them on a arm's length basis, do you recommend that Congress approve or disapprove this agreement?
I strongly recommend that we approve it. As the President said in his message, this is in the national security interests of the United States. It succeeds if we implement it faithfully and carefully, and that is what both of our agencies are pledged to do, and of course we are pledged to keep the Congress closely briefed as we do so.
I would agree, sir. It is important to us both for our non-proliferation objectives as well as our commercial interests in this growing market for nuclear power around the world. And I'm also convinced that we have put into place through this agreement, as well as the 810 process and the other reviews, and the way in which we approve specific transfers of technology, components, materials, a very rigorous way of ensuring that our interests are protected.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Thank you. General Klotz, I want to make sure I understood your answer to the question about CAP 1400. So if we provide a certain technology, nuclear technology, to the Chinese, and they significantly modify it for retransfer to some other countries, what exactly does this agreement give us by way of right of review and approval?
Sir, any technology related to the main nuclear technology parts of a reactor exported from the United States constitutes U.S. technology under the terms of the
Irrespective of modification.
That would have to be something that would be reviewed on a case-by-case basis to determine the level of modification, to what extent U.S. technology was involved, or to what extent indigenous development had taken place. But any technology that is exported falls under that, and we've informed our Chinese counterparts and companies of our review that the inclusion of U.S. technology in the CAP 1400 requires U.S. consent prior to its retransfer from China.
And have they agreed to that?
I don't think we've gotten to that stage yet where they have exported the CAP 1400.
I guess I would just note for you that if I were looking at a list of things that give me concern and pause, that's one of them. Your words notwithstanding, it's not entirely reassuring, especially the caveat that, well, it would depend on the extent of the modification. If I were a Chinese lawyer, that would be a big hole I would drive a big PLA truck through, or at least know I could. Mr. Countryman, a devil's advocate question for maybe both of you, but maybe I could start with you. I mean, this is a well-intentioned agreement. It provides a framework without which we don't have any leverage or control. It's a growing market. Looks like China's on track to maybe being the biggest nuclear market by 2030 or 2040, bigger than our own. It's certainly the only big new expanding market, because we're not expanding here that much. If I were a Westinghouse, I'd definitely want to be in that market. But your own testimony and made before the other body was that, frankly, they don't have the capability to manage everything they've got, let alone this big expansion, from the point of view of the concerns of this agreement. We do know they have a history of proliferating. I mean, while they're part of P5+1, and I'm glad they are, on the other hand, they helped the Iranian nuclear development program. They helped the Pakistan nuclear development program. And so what about this agreement gives us any level of confidence that we can deter that pattern of behavior, that we're turning over a new leaf with a reinvigorated agreement from 30 years ago that catches the behavior we've witnessed in that time period when we had an agreement in place? Is it a matter of enforcement? Is it a matter of capability and training? Is it a matter of political will here? Or is it a matter of just a relentless pattern of probing and cheating and clandestine activity by the Chinese government that, frankly, we're not going to catch and we're not going to deter?
Well, thank you, sir. It's a good question. And if the turning point in Chinese behavior were 2015, it would be the crucial question. But in fact, the turning point in Chinese behavior occurred in the 1990s. The conditions that Congress established in 1985 on the original Reagan administration agreement included ceasing support to the Iranian and Pakistani nuclear weapons programs. And China did that. It joined the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. It joined the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Its record, as I said, in terms of what we call strategic trade controls, export controls, remains inadequate. On the question of can they manage all of these obligations, I think that they can manage a large nuclear program. What we're urging them to do is to devote a fraction of the resources, money, and personnel that they devote to managing a big nuclear program to managing an export control program. We believe that they can do that. Do we take for granted that their performance will improve? No. And the assurances that are contained here are not by themselves adequate. As in every other part of the 123 agreement, it requires constant, persistent follow-up, and that's exactly what you will have.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Rohrbacher.
A question not related to today, but Does India have nuclear weapons?
India has nuclear weapons.
Okay, that's just what my colleague and I were discussing that. Let me ask you about this. What we're talking about here is setting up a guidelines so that we can do business and sell designs that will come from the United States, and our designs for a nuclear reactor, peaceful use of nuclear weapons program. Will we be selling also, does this set the guidelines, will we be selling actual equipment? Will we be exporting equipment that's built in the United States as well?
Yes, the agreement serves as the framework for specific authorization licensing by the Department of Energy and or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to do that.
So we would expect both our technical designs and also our actual machinery to be sent, available to China as a result of this agreement.
Yes, if licensed again, if approved again by the
if
Department.
approved, yes, of course. Let me ask you this, in terms of the type of nuclear reactor that we're approving, are these light water reactors? Are these the light water reactors that we'll be sending?
Yes.
Okay. So light water reactors are, how different will the light water reactors be that, we guaranteed that Japan, for example, would have the ability, and they did, followed through on the foolproof nuclear reactors that we sent them. Are these reactors going to be different than the ones we sent Japan that have not proven not to be foolproof?
I assume you're referring to the Fukushima
I would just
accident,
make
yes.
that assumption, yes.
Yes, sir.
go right
And of
ahead.
course, that was a seminal event that got the attention of the nuclear industry and nuclear scientists, technicians, and engineers across the world. And a lot of changes have been made domestically in terms of the safety procedures that have been put in place here in the United States and overseas. The Chinese went through a pause in terms of approving new construction and certifying plants that had already been constructed as a result of their review of their own processes and procedures post-Fukushima. We're moving through successive generations of nuclear reactors. The AP1000 represents a Gen 3 Plus with a lot of safety, passive safety features which are designed to ensure that the plant remains safe, not necessarily always with human intervention, if there is some major catastrophic breakdown in the system or some external event.
But they're still light water reactors. Let me just note that there are new generations that people have say we are capable of building that would leave light water reactors in the past, and meaning that's old stuff. And what we're doing is putting little improvements on old technology. When you talk about light water reactors, I am dismayed that our economy and our government and our establishment here has been unable to go to the next generation of nuclear power, which I understand we are capable of building, which does not have leftover plutonium, for example, and doesn't have the waste problem in terms of, by the way, does this, are we permitting the type of nuclear reactors that will have leftover material that needs to be protected, put in the Yucca Mountain of China for 1,000 years?
In short, yes.
Okay, thank you. I think that's absolutely absurd for us to be shipping things like that to China or building them here when we have the capabilities of moving on to a new generation of nuclear reactors that don't have that problem. And I'm on the Science Committee, so I've been involved in this thing for a while. And we've already talked about the Chinese track record. I don't think the Chinese do have a good track record in terms of, it is my understanding that they've had something to do with the proliferation of nuclear weapons to Pakistan. And Not to mention, there's a controversy about how much influence they have on Korea, and Korea has certainly not played a positive role. Let me ask you this in terms of, well, let me put it this way. The last time I was confronted by these arguments, and I've been here for 26 years now, I made there's two mistakes I've made in Congress. Number one was well, I made lots of mistakes in Congress, but the ones I regret the most was, number one, following George W. Bush into Iraq and just taking his word about they were having a nuclear program in Iraq, which was, I believe, a fraudulent claim, because it would have taken them 20 years to build a nuclear weapon, or maybe longer, if they could have ever built it at all. We went into Iraq. For some other reason, it was a disaster. The other thing that I regret, however, the most that I regret, is that when I was talked into agreeing that American satellites could be launched on Chinese rockets, this is back in the 1990s, and I will tell you that we had people just like yourselves here testifying how that is no possibility would there ever be any type of technology transfer. This is going to be so controlled, and guess what happened? We ended up with a major transfer of missile technology to China, and to the degree that China today threatens us. It threatens us because of the rocket technology, the MIRVing that we provided them, the stage separation that we provided them, and we had people just like yourselves here guaranteeing us that that would never happen. And I'm sure you're very sincere, but I believe you, but I don't believe our system actually is efficient enough to back up the promises that you've made. So I would oppose expanding this type of thing to China. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering if you could speak about how you assess this agreement will impact our security interests within the Asia-Pacific region and our relationships with our allies and partners.
Thank you very much. It's a great question. First, as I said, in the complex bilateral relationship we have with China, affirming our nuclear relationship, which is at heart a commercial relationship with security controls from our side, is essential to being able to talk to the Chinese as partners, as a growing power with whom we have to contend, who is both a partner and a rival. The other states of the region, I believe, support this agreement because it provides for an element of stability in the U.S.-China relationship. I'll note that you also have before you the similar 123 agreement with the Republic of Korea for your consideration. I also recommend it strongly. These are, in fact, the ROK, China, and Japan, I consider to be our three most important global partners in civilian nuclear power on both a technological and a commercial sense. And so this provides an element of stability. It also provides, crucially, an important step towards the development of carbon-free energy sources. And Asia is, of course, the region that is more threatened by rising sea levels than any other part of the world. So I see it only as positive. I am not aware of any criticism from any of our friends in Asia about this agreement.
Thank you.
Could I add
Please.
to that, please, because it's a very important question.
Yeah.
The way we would look at it, I think, from the Department of Energy and the National Nuclear Security Administration is it is important for all the countries in the region, our allies, China, that if they're going to operate civilian nuclear power programs, that it be done in the safest possible manner, the securest possible manner, with all appropriate safeguards in force. And so our ability to engage and dialogue with the Chinese on these important issues is extraordinarily important, not just for China, but for our allies and partners in the region as well.
Thank you. My next question has to do with the effectiveness of both our ability as well as the Chinese government's ability to monitor and control exports by private companies. My assumption is, and I'd like to hear what you have to say, but that there's a lot of room for improvement, and if so, what's the plan to improve that area?
Right. Well, first of all, I am always impressed when I see the programs administered primarily by the Department of Commerce, but also by other U.S. agencies that improve the capability of American exporters to watch what they are exporting, to be aware of laws and regulations that change regularly. And major defense and high technology contractors have effective internal control programs that ensure they don't get in trouble with their own government. We recommend such programs strongly, and in fact, we have partnered with the Department of Commerce to assist the Chinese in providing that kind of training to major exporters within China. We've encouraged that model. But it is ultimately the responsibility of the Chinese government to devote those kind of resources and to make that kind of training, that kind of internal control program a more regular feature among Chinese enterprises.
If there is an illicit transfer that's been identified by the United States, is China and the Chinese authorities cooperating in how they're handling that or stopping that from moving forward?
The record is mixed. There are more cases in recent years of the Chinese taking action to block such transfers, but it is far from a complete or a satisfactory record.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair yields to Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Countryman, while I understand the need for information sharing between China and the United States, both in my home state and in Georgia, we have reactors under construction. And can you explain to us what the extent of the construction of Chinese reactors plays in terms of our diplomatic and economic relationship with China?
That's a big question. Very hard to summarize, sir. As I noted, there are 100 different issues in terms of our bilateral relationship with China. Nuclear trade is very large, and yet it is a small fraction, and I'll try to get you a percentage of the overall volume of U.S.-Chinese trade. It has, however, a political significance that is greater than the actual percentage volume of bilateral trade. It is, for the Chinese, a recognition that we have a partnership between countries that are approaching the similar level of technological development in the nuclear energy field. And for that reason, it is, it's not a matter of ego, it's a matter of assurance to the Chinese that we take them seriously on issues that are to our mutual advantage. But hard for me to be more precise given the extreme range of bilateral issues that we work on.
But the bottom line, it's beneficial.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate that you recognize the carbon-free energy production, and somehow we need for you to get this message across that carbon-free energy production in China is also carbon-free energy production within the United States, and that it's very beneficial, and somehow the definition in one part of the world should apply around the world. So I appreciate you raising that. General Klotz, it's always great to see you. I appreciate so much your service to our country. As a member not only of this committee, but the Armed Services Committee with 4 sons currently serving in the U.S. military, myself, ensuring our national security is my top priority. That said, can you describe and offer assurance to this committee, maybe even to members of the committee from California, that this 123 agreement takes the necessary measures to ensure China does not divert U.S. commercial nuclear technology for military use?
What I can assure you of, Congressman, and I appreciate those very kind words, what I can assure you of is that we have set up, I think, a framework agreement in here that is an advance over the 1985 agreement in terms of the processes which are there, the potential downside risk to the Chinese if we come to the conclusion that they are not living up to their agreements in terms of diversion of military technology and non-proliferation provisions that are written into the 123 agreement. And I can assure you that we will be as diligent as the Congressman from California said, we will be as diligent as we can be in terms of our processes within the executive branch and in consultation with Congress to ensure that we go into each and every one of these applications for technology transfer, component transfer, hardware transfer with eyes wide open.
And I appreciate that very much. And additionally, Mr. Countryman, what's your assessment of the current proliferation activity between China and Iran or North Korea?
First, they're two very different situations with similarities. In the case of Iran, we do assess that Li Fengwei, or Carl Li, is the most important procurement agent for the Iranian ballistic missile program, that he remains active, that although Chinese authorities have frustrated him on some occasions, he remains pretty much free to operate, and that is a primary concern of ours in our dialogue with China, one that we continue to press. North Korea is a somewhat different case. North Korea is less dependent on outside economies for development of its nuclear and ballistic missile program than China is, than Iran is. But it still seeks acquisition of high technology equipment and technology in China as well as in Russia and in other locations. And we believe that the Chinese government can and must do more to prevent such procurement networks that are specifically prohibited by United Nations resolutions.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Boyle?
Well, thank you, and I want to thank the chairman and the ranking members of the subcommittees for holding today's important hearing and inviting me to appear. I introduced, along with my colleague, Mr. Wilson, House Joint Resolution 56, the approval resolution of the agreement that we're discussing today, of course, the new 123 agreement. In today's testimony, I'm directing this probably most appropriately to Mr. Countryman. In today's testimony and in similar testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he said, quote, "The proposed agreement would strengthen the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China, benefit the U.S. economy, enhance nuclear safety in China, and improve the environment," close quote. Could you expand on these four advantages of the proposed agreement, and if you could specifically focus on the benefit to the U.S. economy and jobs here at home?
Okay, I might ask my colleague General Klotz to talk a little more about the economic benefit. On the other points, as I've said, it is important to the bilateral relationship, greater, as I said, than the economic value of the agreement itself, in both a positive and a negative direction. It is an important symbol of partnership and cooperation for the Chinese, and failure to implement it would be taken by the Chinese as a step backwards by the United States from our professed desire to be partners where we can and to manage our differences where we have them. On the environmental side, the point is that nuclear power is a carbon-free energy source. It is very much, as President Obama has said, part of our all-of-the-above pursuit of clean energy in the United States and around the world, and this is the important contribution it makes. On nuclear safety, as General Klotz has said, We believe strongly and objectively that U.S. nuclear power plants have the safest design in the world, and more importantly, U.S. involvement on the ground in China helps to inculcate the habits of safety that prevent accidents in the future. And let me ask General Klotz to talk about economic benefits here.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I believe in your second panel you'll have people who can cite chapter and verse and specific statistics in terms of what the economic impact is and jobs, dollars, and that sort of thing. But just let me say, generally, as already been pointed out, in terms of nuclear technology, we are the best in the world. Our scientists, technicians, and engineers are world-class and leaders in this particular field. So from an economic point of view, we have a comparative advantage in this commercial sector. And the benefits for U.S. industry are not just in the sale of a particular piece of hardware, but all the other things that go with it, the post-sale servicing, the technical engineering, the instrumentation and control that affects not just primary vendors, but a host of sub-vendors across the country and practically every state in this country. So it's a huge market that's growing there, and as already been pointed out, if we're not there, someone else will be there. There are other people who build reactors and are aggressively marketing their technology to not just China, but other countries as well.
Well, thank you. And I'll just say briefly before yielding back, such an important point that this isn't a choice of either we do this or it doesn't happen. No, it is going to happen. The question is, do we do it or do our competitors beat us to it? But thank you, and again, I thank the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Countryman, General Klotz. We appreciate your time today and your testimony and responses to our questions. Thank you very much. If, when Mr. Countryman and General Klotz leave the panel, we could get the other panel seated as quickly as possible, we'd appreciate that. Thank you, General. Thank you very much. We're thankful to be joined by a private panel this afternoon as well, and maybe you can answer some of the other questions that were asked up here on economic issues and others. We're pleased to be joined today by Henry Sokolsky. And did I say that right? Close enough? All right. Executive Director of the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center. Daniel Lippman, Vice President for Supplier and International Programs at the Nuclear Energy Institute. And Sharon Squassoni is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And we'll start with you, Mr. Sokolsky.
Members of the committee, my message today is pretty simple. Although it would be a mistake to block this deal, and I think the way this hearing's been framed, that seems to be the only question. It's the wrong question. Nobody's blocking this deal. It's going to go through. So you need to go a little bit deeper than that question. I think you need to approach this deal's implementation with your eyes wide open. Someone read my testimony. They used that phrase already once. lest it encourage more Chinese military nuclear divisions and proliferation of the sort already reported by the administration. They want you to go into classified hearings to find out about what's going on. Do it. I think when you do, you should be disturbed. To avoid this, Congress should condition the agreement two ways: that would neither require China's blessing nor hold up its implementation. I think that's very important. You need to understand where the critics are coming from. They're not going in the direction you're worried about. First, before the executive authorizes any Chinese recycling of nuclear weapons usable plutonium, it's called reprocessing, generated in U.S.-designed reactors, the President should certify that he will secure case-by-case authorizations for each reprocessing campaign the Chinese might attempt, as the U.S. currently requires of Russia. We're not picking on China. It's treating them like Russia. Congress should also ask the executive to publish a clear definition of what U.S.-designed reactor and reactor components are, to clarify what materials require such reprocessing authorizations, and to take care of this question about the CAP 1400, which is a very serious line of inquiry. Second, the President should certify that the agreement's call for creating pre-approved nuclear activities, technologies, and foreign entities won't supersede or interfere with current technology review procedures. Now, to the extent that they claim it doesn't, that should be an easy thing to pass, because no one's going to say that they're not doing it. Great, pass a law, make sure of that. It doesn't look like that in the annex to me. Congress also should ask that the Director of National Intelligence participate in current reviews of nuclear technology transfer authorization requests, and that these requests be shared with appropriate committees of Congress as they used to be. Finally, Congress should ask the intelligence community to assess routinely how Beijing might exploit its civilian infrastructure and American civil nuclear technology for military purposes, and what China's future military nuclear requirements might be. I think this needed to be done. You might have avoided some of the problems with the canned coolant pumps. Why bother? You've mentioned that Chairman Royce, 8 years ago, along with several members, wrote the Defense Secretary about the canned coolant pumps, and they were also concerned about the possibility of reprocessing resulting in nuclear weapon stockpiles. Essentially, they were told, don't worry. Now we're told China probably diverted the pump technology. They don't want to quite say that because it raises legal issues if they actually say it. But it really looks like a duck, and it's waddling like that. It looks like they diverted to upgrade its nuclear submarines. To my knowledge, no one has been disciplined for this slip, nor has our nuke tech transfer process been tightened. The proposed deal, in fact, would loosen this process by creating lists of nuclear activities, technologies, and end users for pre-approval. Industry has long pined for such streamlining. If Congress approves it for a country that is suspected of having diverted nuclear technology, count on industry and other countries, including the riskiest ones, demanding similar treatment. The deal also gives China advance consent to extract as much nuclear weapons-usable plutonium as it wants from spent fuel generated in U.S.-designed reactors. All China must do is settle up front and safeguards and physical security. Unlike the nuclear deal we cut with Russia, which requires approval for each effort to reprocess U.S. origin spent fuel case by case, this deal gives its blanket advance consent that only our closest allies enjoy. The security implications regionally of this are potentially enormous. Japan is contemplating opening a large plutonium reprocessing plant next spring capable of producing 1,500 bombs worth of plutonium a year. If Congress fails to further condition Chinese reprocessing, both China and Japan are more likely to proceed. This, in turn, would pressure South Korea to renew its demand that the U.S. allow it to reprocess. Within 10 to 20 years, expect tens of thousands of weapons worth of plutonium mounting up in East Asia. As my former boss, Andrew Marshall, at the Office of Net Assessment has written, this could produce a potential nuclear avalanche that could be triggered by the least provocations. In conclusion, you have a chance to wire-brush this deal. Regrettably, in 1957, Congress didn't even bother to review the 123 with Iran. 62 years later, we now know how that turned out.
Thank you. Mr. Lippman.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Poe and Salmon and Ranking Member Keating. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I also would like to thank Representative Boyle and Representative Wilson for offering their resolution to approve this new agreement. And I would be remiss if I didn't also thank Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Keating for their hearing in May regarding trade promotion agencies and U.S. foreign policies. We were here to talk about the 123, but when you talk about nuclear exports, financing and the export impact is critical and improves the competitiveness of our industry, just as this 123 has a critical impact on the competitiveness of our industry. You've all talked earlier, so I won't belabor what was said about the job creation and other benefits economically, but I would add that what some people may not know is today there are over 40 American companies doing business in China of all sizes, large and small, and they do it in a wide variety of technical and commercial applications. So this agreement, in addition to having had benefits from job creation and revenue creation, have also hit on a couple of other major national interests, and that is nuclear safety and nuclear nonproliferation. Mr. Rohrbacher, I think correctly, and I would agree, brought up earlier the notion of the importance of nuclear safety. It's something that all of us in the U.S. nuclear industry think about all the time. And having this agreement in place will allow us to cooperate on advanced nuclear technologies that do improve safety, as Mr. Rohrbacher suggested. So the timing is important in this agreement. Yes, it's a growing market, but China is expanding at a rate that requires our engagement right now. We are well positioned in the U.S. industry for success in China. You've discussed the landmark AP1000 contracts, of which I was very proud to be a part. There are currently another 10 reactors being discussed and a third tranche of about another 30 plants. But we are, as some of you have said, not the only potential partner. There are others out there who would like to take our place, to be involved as we are in a critical role in the Chinese nuclear industry. So I'm going to conclude by really saying if the U.S. industry is not permitted to participate in the Chinese market, it impacts our reliability as a supplier, and the Chinese do have other options. We are not their only potential partner. Our abdication of this key market results in the loss of very high-paying jobs in technology and a loss of U.S. influence, as Secretary Countryman said, in nonproliferation, and I would argue also in nuclear safety and nuclear security. If the U.S. were to terminate or significantly curtail cooperation with this market, it's also going to have spillover effects in other potential nuclear markets. Think about what it would look like if you're a country that is thinking of purchasing U.S. nuclear technology if they see a U.S. agreement with China being fraught with difficulty and not renewed or somehow encumbered. So we in the industry urge you to allow this new agreement to enter into force without delay or without undue encumbrance on commercial cooperation or export licensing. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Guasoni.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you, Chairman Salmon and Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and other members of the joint subcommittees for the opportunity to discuss the U.S.-China Nuclear Cooperation Agreement today. I would like to submit my written statement for the record and just make a few points. I think all of the panel members that you've heard this morning have said, on the one hand, China has made some important strides, but on the other hand, its record in nonproliferation is a little bit checkered. And I think I would like to point out that some things have remained really constant over the last 20 years since we have been involved in nuclear cooperation with China. China's intense drive for indigenizing foreign technology, a porous division between civilian and military nuclear activities, anemic resources for export controls, and this hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil approach to export violations. So I'd like to offer some recommendations that greater transparency, enhanced dialogue, and benchmarks for progress in Chinese export control would be welcome improvements to this agreement. So in the agreement itself, what should Congress look for? It's an improvement, but I think you're right to focus on this, what I call the fast track for technology transfer authorizations. And Congress should be careful to assess how well this fast track, which, as Henry quite rightly pointed out, sets up approved, pre-approved entities, pre-approved nuclear technologies, and other things for streamlining, whether this really creates incentives for better Chinese compliance with intellectual property rights. Second, the advanced consent for reprocessing that the agreement provides in Article 6 should be monitored to ensure that if U.S. origin material is reprocessed, that is indeed safeguarded. The agreement allows for the option of reprocessing in a facility on China's eligible facilities list, but that doesn't mean the IAEA will actually inspect it. And please note that our agreement with Russia does not allow for this kind of advanced consent to reprocessing. And third, Article 6 contains unique language on managing separated safeguarded plutonium. And this is a mild reminder to China of the risks of plutonium stocks. For the committee's reference, Japan considers reasonable working stocks at a reprocessing plant to be 10 tons or more of separated plutonium. That is a lot of nuclear weapons. More broadly, Congress needs to consider whether the agreement overall provides adequate nonproliferation assurances regarding the separation of civilian and military nuclear activities, the continued provision of civilian nuclear cooperation by China to Pakistan, and the robustness of China's export control implementation. So, does the agreement provide adequate nonproliferation assurances? China's porous boundaries between civil and military nuclear activities and this intense drive to indigenize foreign technology have resulted in the concerns that you have heard here today about the use of U.S. can pump technologies in Chinese naval reactors. Safeguards are designed to help address that porous boundary, and the fast-track procedures for technology and information transfers that place Part 810 transfers squarely under the Nuclear Cooperation Agreement are designed to increase accountability within the entities in the Chinese government. But Congress could strengthen transparency in a resolution of approval by requiring reporting on steps that the Chinese government has taken to create firewalls between civilian nuclear and military nuclear sites, facilities, and personnel. Additionally, Congress should require reporting on the new fast-track procedures for technology transfer on an annual or biannual basis to assess their effectiveness. Second, Congress should look for assurances that the U.S. government is actively working to persuade China to cap its nuclear assistance to Pakistan, or at least recognize reasonable limits so that it stops undermining nuclear supplier guidelines policies. You could also require reporting on the steps that the U.S. government has taken in that regard. And finally, Congress should seek assurances that China is improving its export controls, at least in the nuclear area. You could require certifications every 5 years that China has taken appropriate and effective steps to improve its export control system and to halt transfers of WMD-related material, equipment, and technology to states of proliferation concern. You should also require the Director of National Intelligence to provide annual unclassified and classified reports to Congress on WMD-related acquisitions and transfers, specifically from China. This would replace the Section 721 reports that have now stopped. My written remarks also include recommendations for Congress to strengthen its oversight generally to reflect new realities and support longstanding policies on nuclear cooperation, and I'm happy to discuss those in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you.
My first question would be directed to Mr. Sokolsky and Mr. Lippman, and it would actually be regarding some of the thoughts and maybe others that Ms. Squassoni has recommended. Some of the recommendations that we would have additional review for export licenses and subsequent arrangements involving components and technology that could be used for naval propulsion, stronger Chinese government control of proliferation by private Chinese entities, or assurances on halting Chinese thefts of U.S. nuclear technology. So if those conditions were established on the implementation of the U.S.-China 123 agreement, how would that potentially impact the U.S.-China nuclear commerce? Would it drive them to not deal with the United States as much if we put those kind of additional safeguards in place? Or given what we heard in the first panel, we have the best technology in the world. Is that good enough to keep them at the table? And then how would it potentially affect non-proliferation goals and carbon emissions? So I'll start with you.
Well, never let it be said that you don't ask a lot of questions in one question.
Nobody's ever accused me of that.
Yes, well, you're a good journalist. Let me try to keep it simple. I think there is a danger if you start conditioning this agreement on getting the Chinese to agree to anything. I wouldn't do that. People are concerned about jobs. By the way, I am not sold that there's that many jobs, and we can get into that in a moment. I think you don't want to upset the Chinese. You know why? Our government is not doing a great job in managing affairs in East Asia. We don't need additional headaches. That's what I would worry about, not the jobs. That said, everything I suggested does not require holding up the agreement or getting the Chinese to admit that they've done something wrong. There's two things. The reprocessing consent rights need to be forced into a situation where if they go down that route and they open up reprocessing, by the way, we should discourage it, then they have to be treated like Russia. And the president's just going to have to certify that that's how he's going to do it. And he needs to announce that now to discourage them from going down that route, because they don't need that to promote nuclear power. The second thing is, you need to get that U.S. design definition down. They defer to industry, essentially, is the testimony we got May 12th, to decide what is and is not of U.S. design. But that's a conflict of interest. Westinghouse, in particular, sells technology as part of the package. We want the government to be in the business of controlling. It has to define what is U.S. designed. And I think you need to focus on those things, and I would focus certainly on the recommendations in my testimony, which are modest. They're twofold. There's some additional requirements to have you more involved, and that's it. I would not hold the deal up, and I would not try to get the Chinese to say certain things. Let the deal go forward, but curtail the two excesses that are identified in the testimony: the reprocessing, which was unnecessary to give advance consent, and I would really get someone to actually say in writing, we are not going to let pre-approvals circumvent the existing procedures, because if anything, the Chinese have established they're not to be trusted on this issue.
Mr. Lippman, if we go ahead and implement the things that have just been recommended, which seem reasonable, does it jeopardize any kind of a relationship? Or, as he said, if we just say, this is the deal, take it or leave it, this is what we're going to do, what are your thoughts?
Certainly any kind of ultimatum-like language that says take it or leave it is not something any reasonable business person would concur with. Second, to Henry's earlier point, if they're using U.S. technology, and they are, then export controls are in place. I mean, that's one of the reasons you transfer technology, is you want other countries to use your technology. Because if they're not using your technology, then you're on the outside looking in commercially. So as long as U.S. technology is used, U.S. export controls are in effect. I would urge you to look at, as I think Mr. Countryman did, the Korea program, which this committee has reviewed in the past. That technology has been in play by the Koreans for decades, since the early 80s. They have improved upon it. They have developed it further, yet it still maintains U.S. export controls. Relative to some of Sharon's suggestions, I would preface some remarks on them by simply saying, I agree with General Klotz that we have a very robust, thorough, and I'll add, time-consuming approach to the processing of export control licensing. And certainly anything that lengthens the cycle time is not helpful. In fact, it's a disadvantage for U.S. countries. However, I think there are some points Sharon made that I would concur with. And I'm not going to, I think, catch them all, but in reading her testimony earlier, the creation of firewalls between civilian and nuclear military sites, facilities, personnel, that sounds very reasonable to us. Requirements for reporting on steps. The United States government has taken to seek Chinese restraint regarding civil nuclear cooperation with Pakistan, both within China, and I think you said also, she said the NSG also. That sounds reasonable to us too. Certifications on the surface sound reasonable, but you have to be careful what you're certifying. I mean, the language is very important there. Transparency is a good thing. Having the Directorate of National Intelligence providing an annual report, classified and unclassified, sounds like a good thing, but it ought to focus on those things controlled by the 123 and not get too far afield. Let's stick to the knitting in the swim lane. Reporting on the administrative implementation of tech transfer on an annual or biannual basis to assess their effectiveness also sounds like something that's reasonable to us. So I think those are things that are reasonable. I might depart company from Sharon with respect to the reprocessing, in that the Chinese have indicated that their intent is to reprocess civilian spent fuel in a civilian facility, and that facility will be open to IAEA safeguards and/or what's known as a voluntary arrangement. Now, Sharon made a point, but you have to make sure they inspect. That's fair enough. But to me, the offer to put a facility under safeguards and to have it voluntarily inspected is to me evidence of good faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to touch base on the environmental impact and risk issues. What does the adoption of the passive safety measures of the AP 1000 mean in terms of environmental impact and risk? Maybe Mr. Lippman or Ms. Squazzoni could comment on that.
Okay. So I might ask for a clarification on environment, because having lived in China for 4 years, it's got some of the worst environment. It's got some of the worst air and water quality that I have personally ever experienced. And having asthma as a result of living there for 4 years, it's the gift that keeps on giving. So yeah. I'm for anything that's going to improve Chinese air and water environmental quality. I think it's important. Like the United States, the Chinese population lives in the east. Coal is in the north and the west. It gets transported, it gets burned over major population centers. Chinese understand this, and the Chinese are taking steps. And it's going to need more than just nuclear energy.
Oh, I know.
To help
solve their environmental problems. I mean, in terms of this particular agreement and the AP 1000 in particular, and if they move away from that kind of design, if
right.
they're not involved in this, what would that mean
right.
in terms of environmental impact and risk?
So let's talk about the risk. That's very, very critical. Clearly, the adoption of passive safety technology like the AP 1000 is an order of magnitude improvement over the current generation of reactors, and that's important. So it mitigates risk. Nuclear safety is important. We do have concerns that a very rapid expansion of a nuclear energy program has to be done in a way that maintains the highest standards, no shortcutting of any sort whatsoever. Passive safety technology allows for less operator intervention. It allows for natural phenomena like condensation, evaporation, and convection to cool the reactor in the case of a major reactor upset like we saw in Fukushima. So we want them to use these technologies with advanced safety concepts. Other companies in the U.S. are talking to the Chinese about small modular reactors, which represent yet another step forward in terms of nuclear safety improvement. And all of these would be critical within the confines of the 123. So we want this agreement to go through so that kind of safety cooperation can continue and mitigate risk.
Yeah, I can associate myself with many of those concerns coming from my own district, where design there is antiquated, and we see some of those problems, and we don't have those passive safety measures even here at home. Would you like to comment, Ms. Squasani, on that?
Yeah, just on that point, I think it's important for the committee to remember that in at least the nuclear safety and nuclear security regimes, there are no internationally binding standards. And so I guess in that sense, the role of industry is very important. And while it's true that, you know, I guess I would caveat that by saying, while it's true that China is building, you know, they're building their EPRs, you know, French technology, American technology, I would also support, you know, the U.S. technology as having excellent safety standards.
I only have 60 seconds left. I just want you to comment on the agreed minute provision in this. Evidently, given some of the testimony, there's some concerns about the effectiveness of that. If you could, just in a little time that remains.
Thank you, Congressman. My view of the agreed minute and placing technology transfer to some degree under the 123 is an important improvement. The concern is somehow that things will get rushed through. I see it as differently. I see it as that if there is a concern or a problem or that the Chinese perpetrate some sort of violation of export controls, it's now a treaty violation. It's not just the violation of an export control rule, it is a treaty violation. And not being an attorney, though, my understanding is that that is much more of a serious problem for the Chinese.
To come full circle with the testimony of Mr. Countryman, when he mentioned politics, I think that shows how maybe some of that can re-enter into this afterwards, if necessary. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Poe.
Thank you all for being here. Mr. Lippman, your colleagues have made several recommendations to us to put in the 123 agreement. Do you agree with those recommendations? Without going through all of them, do you agree with them or not agree with them?
I agree with some of the recommendations indicated, Sharon's in particular. I generally would like to see this agreement go through without encumbrance. I do understand, separate from this committee, that in fact there are other concerns in other committees relative to the military diversion issue. We understand those are being addressed. We do concur with the role of the intelligence community. We think they are already engaged in this process, but others would like to see a stronger role. We, of course, as patriotic Americans, want to make sure that our technology is only utilized for peaceful purposes, and involvement of the intelligence community and other branches of government that assure that in a process that allows us to go forward commercially is something we would support.
How much money are we talking about as far as industry goes that the U.S. would be able to benefit if we go and build it and maintain it, as opposed to the French?
Okay, so this is a 30-year agreement, and so it's hard to...
If you can kind of cut to the chase,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Lippman.
Yes, sir. So I would say you've got $12 billion in sales under the current agreement. You probably have another another $30 to $60 billion under current negotiation, and one might say that going forward in a 30-year basis, you would have several $billion per annum in sales in each of the 30 years of the agreement.
And as I asked Mr. Countryman when he was here, having a presence in China, building it, has an advantage over not having a presence and somebody else building it. Would you agree with that or not?
Absolutely correct.
Because when you build it, you monitor it, the safety, the security. Is that correct or not?
You not only build it, but you're there for, in many years, in many aspects, decades, for decades to come, because you service the plant, you refuel the plant, you sell renewal parts. You're working with the Chinese in a variety of different industrial cooperative relationships.
So you don't build it and then you come back to Texas, so to speak.
No,
you
sir.
stay over there, maintain it, supervise it, like you would any other project that you would build.
That is correct. We're not selling Pepsi, Chairman. We're there for the long haul.
Or Dr. Pepper in Texas.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you this: the Russia, we have a 1-2-3 agreement with Russia. It expires in 28 years, I believe. It's a 30-year agreement. Were you involved in that at all?
No, sir.
Were any of you involved in the Russia 1-2-3 agreement? You were involved in it? Okay. Your recommendation is when we design this 1-2-3 agreement with China, we make sure the same rules that we requested and have with Russia are in this agreement. Is that a fair statement? Treat them the same. Treat the Chinese and the Russians the same. And reprocess it. Okay. Thank you for that recommendation. Let me ask you another question. If my list is correct, let me say it this way. I think the public is concerned about a lot of things. We're concerned about when you mention nuclear capability, people get nervous. So we have civilian nuclear capability. We have military nuclear capability. And then we have intercontinental ballistic missile capability to deliver nuclear weapons. Those are kind of the three things I think we're all concerned about. My understanding is correct. There are 9 countries that have nuclear weapon capability as of today: U.S., Russia, United Kingdom, France, China, India, Israel, Pakistan, and the latest being North Korea in 2006. Look down the road, if you would. Where do we see nuclear weapon capability going? Who's next? Who's next? Any predictions?
I just wrote a book.
I know. I got your book up here. I got your book. So tell me the countries that we should be concerned about.
I would worry a lot about East Asia. I've been
specifically who?
Japan, South Korea, and it's even conceivable Taiwan.
How about Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey?
You asked which ones are the quickest. Okay. In time, yes, you get a benefit of possible competition in the Middle East, and all of the ones that you've heard, all the ones that you've said, get thrown in as well. The reason you have to worry about the Far East, however, is because the line between civil and military is much more blurred there than any other place in the world, with a possible exception of India. And the Japanese have been playing a game of plutonium poker for many decades. They pile up plutonium, they don't burn it. That gets our attention. We will give you a nuclear guarantee. It gets the attention of China and South Korea, who are very upset about it. There is no agreement about reprocessing in China, and there's clear proof. It's not in the 5-year plan yet. I spoke with the chairman, former chairman of the Chinese National Nuclear Corporation, which makes the nuclear weapons and is interested in promoting the reprocessing. He said, we do worry about safety. That's the reason we need to have your cooperation, because we are going primarily with the American design. The French, by the way, I don't think you need to worry about the French. They are in receivership, sir. They are not competitive. They may not even make another reactor at the rate they're going, given the troubles they have. Korea and Japan, let's just say they will follow our lead. I think you need to be a little bit more upbeat about what's possible and understand that the Chinese also see this deal as something that might benefit them. And we need to be aware of that. Don't hold it up, but focus on the reprocessing because it's contingent. You do not want those Asian countries piling up plutonium. And I would pay attention to the export control stuff. I
Thank
would.
you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding these hearings. The White House decided to convene a meeting that conflicted with these on the Iran nuclear deal. But this nuclear deal may not be getting the same level of publicity, but also poses interesting policy questions. Mr. Lippman, we're going to be restricting China from re-exporting U.S. technology. The issue is, what is U.S. technology? One can imagine a gallon of paint that's American with 1 drop of Chinese technology in it. One can imagine a gallon of Chinese technology with 1 drop of American technology in it. What's the definition of U.S. technology subject to export control?
Thank you, Mr. Sherman, Ranking Member Sherman. I don't think there is something formulaic, but I'll give you a business guy's response to it. Technology is generally comprised in technology transfer agreements, commercial technology transfer agreements, as foreground technology and background technology and joint technology. And there are definitions, business definitions in these agreements. If the Chinese have taken AP 1000 technology and modified it, the so-called CAP 1400, as some have indicated, that's still U.S. technology. Why is that U.S. technology? Because under definitions of the tech transfer agreements between the 2 companies, and I was then a Westinghouse executive involved in that, that clearly has a basis in U.S. technology. Over time, as the designs evolve and change fairly radically, they can change fairly radically, that becomes far more tenuous. But certainly as we look forward over the next decade or more, and we look at the evolution of Chinese designs, which we can and which we do because we are involved in them, they're clearly based, at least the advanced passive technology, are clearly based on U.S. technology in our view.
Japan has constructed a large reprocessing facility which it wants to take online in the next few years. I think Mr. Sokolsky has commented on that. South Korea has been interested in reprocessing and demanded that the United States agree to a process enshrined in a new 123 agreement that we have with South Korea, currently pending before Congress, whereby in about 6 or 7 years we would have to decide whether to give them consent. We'd have to say yes or no. China's agreement with the U.S., which is the one we're having these hearings on, provides, it appears to be an advance consent to reprocess, subject only to the facility being made available for safeguarding. We just had hearings yesterday. Apparently China, Japan, and South Korea are not always real happy with each other and may not be sanguine as one or the other moves toward reprocessing, may be anxious to stop reprocessing in one of the others. Mr. Sokolsky, should we be concerned that we would have many tons of separated plutonium available for weapons in each country that may be reprocessing, as all 3 may be reprocessing in the future? And perhaps would these countries be interested in a mutual moratorium on reprocessing? Are they more interested in reprocessing themselves or causing one of their neighbors perhaps to not reprocess for a while?
I took a trip, actually 2 trips, to try to promote, and for what it's worth, I talked with the government, our government, before I went. I did not go commando. there is material I want to place in the record. One of the pieces is that proposal that we floated. And it was, we should back off going ahead with the program President Obama is uncomfortable with, and that is the Savannah River Project, which is a plutonium fuel project. Japan should not open up Rikasho in March of next year because it doesn't have any way to fabricate the fuel, and they've already indicated they want to pile up another 3 tons of material minimum. By the way, when you say ton, it's 1,000 kilograms. Divide by roughly 4 or 5, and you get the number of bombs worth. It's a lot of material. The Koreans were apoplectic when they heard about this. The Chinese have gone public in their opposition. One of the people I talked with in China, who was very highly placed, said, we may not come to the Nuclear Security Summit if you don't put a collar on this, we don't work on this. Each of them made very clear that their plans to go ahead were not fixed. And even the Japanese that I spoke with would like to figure out some way to get an off-ramp to what they've done. They have local constituents just like we do, and they're pressing for jobs. But if there was an international effort to take a time out, you could speak to them and say, well, they're higher priorities. I think this is the moment. It's one of the reasons I'm very anxious that you say something about reprocessing in this deal, because if China gets green-lighted, it'll encourage Japan to just go ahead. If Japan goes ahead, then the Chinese will say, well, we need to hedge our bets. You do not need to do this for commercial nuclear power. It is not economic. You lose money. It is a dangerous weapons-related activity for the most part.
Thank you. I'd comment that we may want to have a Pacific Nations conference on reprocessing to discuss all 3 countries and perhaps our own reprocessing, and maybe countries would see mutual security in that. I'd ask unanimous consent to put in the record a letter from the IBEW, my own opening statement, an article from Foreign Affairs, and other scholarly articles.
Without objection. Mr. Boyle.
Yes, thank you. And I wanted to follow up on a question that I had asked the last panel, and they mostly answered it, but when I specifically asked about the economic impact and jobs, they deferred to the second panel. And Mr. Lippman, I read in reading all your testimony, including the very helpful appendix, which is entitled Economic Impacts of U.S. Nuclear Exports to China. I think perhaps you would be the best person to direct this question toward.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. The job creation from nuclear exports to China under the current agreement have been very, very significant. About 12,000 to 15,000 direct jobs and an equal number of what they call induced or indirect jobs were also part of this. But as you go forward in the implementation of the agreement under consideration, the renewal, the estimates, as you will have seen in the report, indicate, I think, between about 30 to 35,000 direct jobs created and sustained over a 30-year period. It is very, very significant job creation. And it is job creation of high technology, high skill type of work, which is, I think, very, very important. And I know the comment was made earlier, well, you know, maybe we don't worry about the jobs, but the very submittal that Ranking Member Sherman just talked about, he talked about the IBEW letter. Well, you all know the position of trade unions on trade agreements. You just went through something here in the last month. So it is very significant that all of the major unions, the IBEW, the United Association, and the Boilermakers, have all come out in support of this renewal. Now, why would that be? Well, because there are jobs created. There are jobs created for pathway into the middle class. These are jobs that pay a family wage, and so we are very, very concerned. We do worry about the jobs creation here. Thank you, Mr. Boyle.
Well, and I would say just not to repeat everything you've just said, but clearly we're not talking about minimum wage jobs. We're talking about well-paying jobs. And certainly toward the point that Mr. Salkowski interjected earlier, that's certainly not the only consideration. We are, after all, in a foreign affairs committee setting. It's by far not the only consideration, but it is still a legitimate and valid consideration, and one that I think in each one of our 435 districts, we've been approached and talked about the importance of jobs and family-sustaining jobs. Well, here we have a wonderful opportunity. I don't know if, in the interest of fairness, if you wanted to comment, since you had questioned the extent to which you think, not to put words in your mouth, but I got the impression that you thought that maybe the number of jobs was being overstated. Is that?
You know, I don't want to wade into other people's turf. I think you should be skeptical, however, over the long haul as to what the Chinese are up to. They like making their own stuff. If you take a look at the complaints they've had about the canned coolant pumps, which were defective, some of the valves, they want to make them themselves. One of the reasons I think they raided our various servers was to get the information. Now, that said, information isn't enough. They're going to need our advice. You don't really need a 123 agreement to get that advice, by the way. There are other ways you can do things. I don't think that should be what's driving how you think about this. If there are jobs, fine. If there aren't, fine. The bigger questions are the security questions. After all, nothing that has been said at this panel stops this deal, doesn't even stop reprocessing. But there is a certain looseness with regard and enthusiasm for doing certain things in the deal that I would condition, and I wouldn't ask the Chinese for permission. It isn't take it or leave it. It's just good governance. So I don't think you have to choose between the deal and no deal, or reprocessing and no reprocessing, though.
Well, I thank the panel for their participation. Again, I want to thank the chairman and ranking members for inviting me here today.
Thank the panelists for their testimony and their answering of the questions. We really appreciate it, and without further objection, this committee will be adjourned. Well, you sold yet on the Iran deal?